This week on To the Contrary.
First, Catholic organizations claim denial of First Amendment rights. Then, women inmates sterilized. Behind the headlines, homegrown human trafficking.
Hello, I'm Bonnie Urbay. Welcome to the Contrary, a discussion of news and social trends from diverse perspectives. Up first, healthcare reform split.
The Obamacare free birth control mandate got an unlikely ally this week. The Catholic Health Association, or CHA, now says it's okay with the administration's latest compromise. Obamacare mandates all insurance should cover contraceptives free of charge. But members of the Catholic hierarchy objected, and Catholic faith-based nonprofits filed lawsuits saying that mandate violates their free exercise religious rights. The CHA represents hospitals that treat 1 in 6 American patients. The latest administration compromise puts insurance providers, not Catholic hospitals or faith-based nonprofits, in direct touch with employees to provide free birth control. It takes the protesting hospitals and nonprofits out of the loop and does not use any of their funds to provide the disputed coverage. While the CHA says this compromise does not violate the hospital's religious liberties, the U.S. Conference of Bishops is still staunchly opposed. The bishops say the regulations prove the Obama administration is hostile toward religious freedom. Churches, synagogues, and mosques are exempt.
So, Megan Beyer, is this latest compromise still a violation of free exercise rights under the Constitution?
Absolutely not. This is simply a matter of separation of church and state.
I do think it is coercive to have individuals and companies have to pay for something that they don't want to pay for.
It is hard to believe that if the Catholic hospitals don't have to provide the services or pay for the services, their right to religious expression is violated.
No, this is still definitely a problem, and it's assuming that contraception is the #1 concern for all women.
Well, but wait a second. First, I want to get first to the Constitution and the meaning of the free exercise clause. And I'm a little confused because it clearly churches within churches have, and in society in general, have a right to exercise their religion the way they see fit. Does that extend, do you think the framers meant to extend that to businesses that churches run in the form of hospitals or other nonprofit groups?
And then why not their supply chain?
Yeah, I mean, obviously this was something that the founders could not have envisioned whatsoever. They're looking, think back to 1750. They were trying to escape from King George, who was not allowing them to practice their religion, period. So I think this is very different. And again, I think the fact that Catholic organizations get so many breaks from the government, I mean, this has gotten so muddled over the years that it's not exactly this clean cut.
But you said earlier that you think you are opposed to the idea of forcing them to offer something they don't want to offer on the basis of their religion.
Well, I think it is coercive to have an individual or a company or an organization or anyone have to pay for a product or service that they don't support or believe in. So just taking a step back, religion aside.
But the Obama administration did pull back and say change compromised the first time. It's compromised a couple of times now, saying that these organizations did not have to pay for it. It was all the insurance companies have to pay for it.
Exactly. The insurance companies are paying for it, but nothing is free. So where is this money coming from? It's coming from premiums elsewhere. Money is fungible. So will people be paying more money elsewhere and then having this work out? It just, to me, it's very blurry.
Well, it's blurry because what are the bishops after? And this is the problem. We have a health care law that mandates that certain services are provided, including contraceptives, and they don't want to comply with that law. And I think the reason, there's the Obama administration trying to reach all sorts of compromises that I think as a lawyer they should not reach, but they are because they're political compromises, and it's not enough for the bishops.
And the thing is, if you were to poll the Catholic people. I mean, it's very clear that there's no great unanimity among Catholics about banning contraceptives. And I think that what's happened is Catholics have gone along with the bishops, they've been in lockstep, but now that this compromise has been presented, that the Hospital Association has accepted, this is a breaking of the ranks, and I think there'll be a cascade of finding this as a very good solution.
You know, there's always unintended consequences, and I think that this mandate, something that's been overlooked, is that when you start providing, or at least heavily subsidizing all contraception, it means that we're going to skew the marketplace tremendously. Suddenly things like the procedure to place an IUD in somebody is going to be covered, pushing all sorts of other manufacturers out of the business, and most importantly, it's going to push condoms out of the marketplace, which is the only thing that's actually going to protect against STDs. And that is not talked about when we talk about contraception, and I think it's a very important point to make.
I have to say, the interesting thing about this debate is that I thought the train had left the station. We're not talking about a new technology or something that is a mystery that could have the unintended consequences that you're mentioning.
But wait,
we're
is
talking
it true
about
that
basic services.
Is it true that contraceptives, condoms are not considered contraceptives and are not covered by the insurance plans?
I think it's over-the-counter contraceptions, and let's be honest, women are going to take more responsibility on these things. This is why, right, the male contraceptive has not been adapted, and it's certainly the research behind that is going to go away.
I am curious here. You're worried about when this law takes effect that more women will use contraceptives and fewer condoms, and therefore be exposed to ST. Because that's an argument I haven't even heard yet.
Right? No, they will forget. More and more people will say, "Well, you know, I'm on birth control or I have an IUD," and they'll forget that. Guess what? That doesn't actually protect against STDs.
But what does that have to do with free exercise?
Because when we're talking about what might happen in this marketplace, everyone's assuming that mandating free contraception is a good thing, an all-around good thing, but there are unintended consequences that I think we should consider.
But getting back, again, my main question, and I haven't heard your response to this, and I would like to hear it, is the free exercise clause talks about when I hear the church claiming that their free exercise rights are being violated, I'm stunned, because it seems to me that nobody's going into the church and saying you can't preach against abortion, you can't get politically involved, which a lot of people have problems with. Sure. All they're saying is that when you walk away, at least a couple of steps away from the process of running a church and running a religion, and you're now running businesses, right, that you don't have to abide by federal law, sure, because it violates your free exercise rights.
Well, I think Nikki's correct that it gets very blurry. I think that any group that doesn't want to provide something, whether I don't think this has to do with Catholicism, right? This is about your free exercise of speech and religion, and we've gotten so confused here in what this law means. I don't think anyone at this table has a unified view on exactly what's covered and what's being mandated here.
But you know, when we talk about the separation of church and state, and we talk about these religious freedoms, look at what's happening in the world today. Look at what's happening in Egypt. Look at what is happening in Turkey. And these were societies where they expected to be living in a democracy, and leaders who had decided that religious norms were going to be the law. And that threatens the democracy. We've seen it in Turkey, we've seen it in Egypt. And I think having this respect for an accommodation that makes that separation of church and state is good for the democracy.
All right, let us know what you think. Please follow me on Twitter at Bonnie Urbay. From birth control to sterilization.
Nearly 150 female inmates in California were sterilized between 2006 and 2010. That, according to the Center for Investigative Reporting, which also reveals another 100 women prisoners in California were sterilized since the late 1990s. Former inmates recall medical staff pressuring pregnant women to undergo sterilization. But a doctor in charge of OB-GYN services at Valley State Prison told the center nobody was pressured. And in fact, he said the procedure was only recommended to women with multiple children and who had served multiple jail sentences. A licensed psychologist there told the center some pregnant inmates, particularly those on drugs or who were homeless, would commit crimes so they could return to prison for better health care. The procedures cost some $150,000 over a decade.
So Sabrina Schaeffer, your thoughts on this?
Well, I was concerned when I first read the report that these women were genuinely coerced into having some kind of medical procedure, and sterilization is a serious one, against their will. But I'm not quite sure that's exactly the case. If it's the case that they were sort of given education and it was suggested to them this may be, good family planning for their particular situation, then I suppose that they made a choice that fits for their purposes.
Well, that's not the story. At least some of the examples of women, they were in labor. They were in really difficult moments in their lives, and the doctors kept repeating and repeating and repeating, you should do this, you should do this. They were advising women that have multiple C-sections to do it because that was better for their health, when the practice does not recommend sterilization in order to protect your health because you have 3 C-sections, and if you have a 4th child, you may die.
But
so there was an extreme, they were at the line.
But let me ask
course.
you this, because I think this story raises an interesting question, which is, I guess everybody would agree that all Americans have an unfettered right to have as many kids as they want, no matter how incapable they are as parents. And I'm sorry, but I would say that somebody who lands in jail is not a capable parent. And in many cases, these women already had multiple children, 4, 5, 6, had been in jail, recidivists in jail again and again and again. So do they have an unfettered right to keep creating children that they can't properly take care of? Secondly, do they have an unfettered right for taxpayers to keep paying for the messes that they make in the form of these children who are not going to grow up to be happy people because their mothers are stealing cars and ending up in jail?
I'm going to take a step back. I think we have an incarceration problem in this country. Looking at, I pulled ACLU numbers before I came in. There are 8 times more women in jail now than there were in 1980. African American women are 30% of the jail population. They're only 13% of the population outside. So we're over-criminalizing, we're putting people in jail above and beyond, keeping them there, and we're setting these women up for a life of failure. So I think that's one concern for me. Another concern for me is, how can you make an informed decision when there are laws in California against having these questions brought up and raised? These women are in labor, these women are under duress, these women are shackled. I mean, obviously there are safeguards in place. Federal money can't be used for this, so they use state money. State even says you have to have, there were all these different laws and things that had to be signed off on. Bodies were not notified. So certainly these women were treated very, very badly. Even if they shouldn't be having children, they deserve better than this.
Well, the California prison system, in fact, right now is in the midst of the prisoners are having a food strike on an issue that's related to health as well.
The incarceration of this is male prisoners, but in solitary confinement for 25 years.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. So actually the backdrop here and the context, which I think is really important, Bonnie, is that they've been under receivership since 2006, and this was a failure of the receiver because they should have known that you have to go to a medical review board to have this procedure done, sterilization. The receiver must have seen that line item, and they knew that they'd heard nothing about the procedures being done. So I think more than anything, this story is an indictment on what's happening in the California prison system.
Yeah, and I'm not surprised. I'm a native Californian. There's a whole lot of mess there, and all sorts of the state-run systems, from the workers' comp situation to the prisons, to their health care. So I think that this is an example of where California needs to tighten the reins and take a step back.
But let's say it's not just a California problem. I don't know if it's going on in other areas. But getting back to my question, do you believe that whether prisoners or not prisoners, people have a totally unlimited right to have as many kids as they want, and most people would agree to that. And do you agree? And do you also agree that they have an unfettered right to go on all kinds of government assistance to have these kids when they can't afford them, to take care of them?
Well, I come from Virginia, and in Virginia we have a shameful history of eugenics. And it was actually in Virginia in the 1920s that a case was taken to the Supreme Court, which resulted in a lot of laws throughout the country that would not only make sterilization something you could do, but something you must do if a person was mentally ill, an imbecile, or had epilepsy. And so, yes, the pendulum has to go swinging in either direction. I would much prefer to see it swing in the direction of human rights.
All right. Behind the headlines, human trafficking is a $32 billion per year industry. Around the globe, millions of young women and men are forced into prostitution and slave labor every year. But there are heroines working to combat the problem. Step one, create more awareness.
Many people thought it's someone else's problem until they started to understand that often runaway children, particularly little girls, can easily be seduced and convinced that they're going to be a model or they're going to be a dancer, and they end up not ever seeing the light of day again.
Marilyn Carlson Nelson of the global travel and hospitality company Carlson Companies is a leader in the fight against human trafficking. So is Homeland Security Secretary Janet Napolitano. Ending sex trafficking is part of her job, as is making the American public more aware of human trafficking.
There is no community in the United States that is immune from this. It is an international plague. It's a plague within the United States.
In April, police took down a major trafficking ring in Carlson Nelson's home state of Minnesota. The Twin Cities is one of the United States' largest centers for child prostitution. A 2010 study found on any given night, 45 girls are sold for sex. The rate has begun to decline, due in part to projects like the Women's Foundation's Minnesota Girls Are Not for Sale. Carlson Nelson first learned of the enormity of human trafficking from Queen Sylvia of Sweden.
The Queen spoke to me about travel and tourism and the fact that sometimes these kinds of sexual exploitation take place in hotels, motels, and travel. It sounded serious. It was a dark issue. It began to creep into my consciousness.
Carlson Nelson became the first American CEO to sign an international agreement, ECPAT, the acronym for End Child Prostitution and Trafficking. By signing, a company agrees to a code of conduct that includes educating staff, suppliers, and customers about sexual exploitation.
I came back and spoke to my company, and you can imagine, the first thing people said is, Marilyn, we're in the happiness business. I mean, this is a kind of dark subject. It's almost taboo to talk about using children in this way. It's probably one of the most heinous crimes there is in the world.
She then convinced other corporate leaders from Hilton Hotels and Delta Airlines, among others, to get on board.
Every day we go about our lives.
For its part, the Department of Homeland Security recently relaunched the Blue Campaign, a comprehensive anti-trafficking project that includes training.
Working with air carriers like Delta, for example, to train employees on how to spot some of the signs of human trafficking. And we're doing that throughout the transportation industry, the hospitality industry, and others. As public awareness rises and we train more law enforcement around the country, all of that helps us, I think, make a real dent in trafficking.
But Napolitano says reintegrating minor girls who escape sex trafficking back into society is not easy.
They've gone through a very damaging experience, and so one of the things we're doing is connecting with all of the great service organizations throughout the country who want to provide assistance to these victims.
In Minnesota, the Women's Foundation helped pass the 2011 Safe Harbor Law. It recognizes child prostitutes as victims of abuse, granting them immunity from prosecution.
Their soul has kind of been rent in such a way that their own sense of value has really disappeared.
Despite the nature of the crime, the department's had quite a few success stories.
We have one case involving a person who noticed that there was a teenage girl in the house next door who never seemed to go to school, never seemed to leave, and reported it. We investigated through Immigration and Customs Enforcement, found that it was basically slavery. It was free labor in the home. The owners of the home were arrested and prosecuted. The young woman who we were able to rescue now is in college and wants to be an ICE agent.
Incredible story when you think it's not just finding these mainly young women. 80% of people who are trafficked are women and girls globally, that is, anyway. It's also, think about that experience and then trying to live a normal life after that. I mean,
well, I'm the mother of a 14-year-old girl, so imagine this is very personal at this stage in my life, because that's the age that a lot of these young girls are entrapped into this situation. You know, they told you're going to be a model, or you're going to be a singer, you're going to go to Hollywood, and they turn into prostitution. So I think the work that Carlson is doing in terms of bringing awareness at all levels, Napolitano and the federal government, and I'm very impressed with the Minnesota law, the Safe Harbor law, because I never really thought of that at that point. You know, child prostitution is really not a free will of, you know, these little girls deciding they're going to sell their bodies. It's really they've been enticed by adults into that business, and the government should look at that differently. So,
and a whole cottage industry now of NGOs is coming together. There's one in Washington called Innocence at Risk, and they have been training stewardesses to see
flight attendants,
male and female, and they have actually this new program where they're approaching airlines to see if they can get this little public education brochure put in your seat pocket there, so that while you're sitting on the plane, you can read about what this looks like and when you can identify it. And I just think if our whole society becomes educated, that it will change the equation. This is not something anyone ever wanted to think about.
Right. I think we're all in agreement. Nobody at this table is pro-human trafficking. But this to me is...
And you know what's amazing to me, though, too, is that it is growing.
It's growing.
Yeah. And I mean, and some people are... I've noticed increased awareness recently, but still, most Americans have no idea this is going on.
Exactly. And so you said raising awareness, but to me, this is hard to find. This is difficult to prosecute. This is expensive. Just like prosecuting rape cases, all these unopened, untested rape kits. And then we look at our system of law enforcement that's geared towards numbers and metrics and statistics, and it's easier to pull someone over for speeding and to hit that quota of tickets than it is to do these long, detailed investigations where you have fewer payoffs, but these are much more high impact. So to me, I think this really calls for a big re-examination of what our priorities are.
And I thought that this story in particular helps draw awareness to how serious the problem is here at home, because very often when we talk about sex trafficking, we're thinking about women overseas, and it's much, much harder to get Americans and Westerners in general to think about what's going on in foreign cities and foreign countries. And so I think that this might help on a global level.
Yeah, $32 billion business, 100 million of that right here in our Washington area.
So what do you see as the way to get at it? Again, and let's talk about the fact this is largely internet and increased travel driven. So
well, I do think the travel industry is a great idea, and they're pushing hard on that from all sectors. But then also, this is something that you get an archetypal response from women and mothers. And I do just think that the public education is going to change the equation on it.
And you need to talk to your children, I think, because it's very easy to suddenly become hysterical over something like this and not let your kids walk to the park or not let them go to the movies. And we don't want to live in a society like that kind of alarmism. But I think that having that communication with your children, especially as they get to be in their teenage years, say, hey, these are the rules and these are the people you speak to, goes a long way.
And how do you apply that to the internet, though? Because that is where a lot of these. What do you say to your kid? I have to see everything that you do on the internet. How does that work?
Not a parent yet, so let me know.
But you're on your way. Let me talk about it, Bonnie. Let me talk about it, because I deal with that all the time with my kids. And really, the concept of the internet is basically you're in the park. Basically, when you're internet, you're in public territory, and when you talk to a stranger online, it's like you're talking to a stranger in a park, and they have to understand that themselves. When they put themselves out there, they're exposing themselves, and when a stranger comes, it's a stranger like it's in any other place.
And very quickly, have you stopped your daughter from communicating with anybody
Absolutely,
online?
I can't. It's impossible. It's
You
like
cannot?
asking her not to breathe. I mean, in terms of communicating online, I don't micromanage her online activity. So I have to build a value system within her so she can make the right choices when she's in the situation.
All right, that's it for this edition of To the Contrary. Please follow me on Twitter at Bonnie Bay and at To the Contrary, and visit our website pbs.org/To the Contrary, where the discussion continues. And whether you agree or think to the contrary, please join us next time. That's a good, a really good analogy. But
Also sometimes hard because people have heart, so
right.
yeah, they've seen this before.
You're right. I think this is value community, or the faith communities have been really informed of this. You know, this has been a good sort of bipartisan.
Or the trafficking, the collaboration with conservative communities, because the conservative communities are actually making a
Deborah Sigmund.